At the end of Deltarune Chapter 1, the evil king is defeated, the dark fountain is closed, and all seems to be well for now. The first part of the story is finished, and we head off to bed, wondering what exciting adventure tomorrow will bring. Then, our complacent, silent protagonist Chris suddenly gets out of bed, rips out their soul, and starts to act on their own for the first time in the game. Notably, in this moment, and many other moments like this, we can still control the soul. The nature of this soul is unclear at this point in the story, and a somewhat debated topic in the community, with two main perspectives. Most people believe that the soul is the player, or a representation of the player, while others subscribe to the idea that something else controls the soul, commonly called third entity theory. And I am here to tell you that these are both wrong, but they're also both right. I am here to present the second entity theory. Before we get started, I have to go over a few things. First, a lot of this theory is referencing Jaru's third entity theory video, since Jaru is the biggest advocate for third entity theory in the community. But there are a lot of points in that video that won't really be relevant here, and I will not really go in depth into all of the evidence for that theory, so go watch that video if you want more information about third entity theory. Second, as I kind of already mentioned, I won't really be talking about all the evidence for these common interpretations. I'm kind of assuming you already know all of that. Like, if you found and decided to watch this theory from a channel with like no subscribers, chances are you are very deep down the rabbit hole and you already know all this stuff. And third, second entity theory is kind of a silly name. Like, we can see two different entities. There's Chris and there's the soul. There have to be at least two entities. And this is where we get into the theory. Because it's really about who the second entity is and the fact that there are only two entities at a time. Let me explain. My theory is that these two theories about who's controlling Chris are not actually different theories. Rather, they are two equivalent interpretations of the game, and you can easily turn one perspective into the other with very few changes. I will show this by going through the game and interpreting some moments through both of these perspectives. So let's first establish these two interpretations. There's the player angle and what I'm calling the no player angle. Usually people would call this third entity theory, but I think that's a little bit of a misnomer because at least the way someone like Jaru presents it, there are only two entities here. Like, the whole theory is about the player not explicitly existing in this world, so you wouldn't really count the player as an entity, the same way you wouldn't think of the player as a separate entity in most games. And I know this game is more meta than most games, which is why I think these two interpretations exist in parallel. But they are parallel to each other. They never cross each other, and they both have only two entities. The first entity is, of course, Chris, and the second is the soul, which, according to the player interpretation, is a representation of the player, or is literally the player. According to the no-player interpretation, the soul could be its own character that is controlling Chris, or it could be Chris's soul that is controlled by some character. Either way, we as the player are playing as the character controlling Chris and are not actually in the game. Speaking of, let's get to the actual game, starting from the Gunner Maker. This is either Gaster connecting you to the game through his device, or Gaster connecting the character controlling Chris to the device. Then the vessel is created and discarded, and there's a time skip. We know time passes here because of the bloodstain and the many crashes the cage has gone through and the something Chris owns, among other things. Now, this could potentially be a problem for the interpretation that the soul is literally the player. You could argue that the soul is working on autopilot during this time, or that you couldn't meaningfully change the events of the story anyway, or something like that. But there is another argument, which is that we have another player interpretation. The soul could still be a direct representation of the player. The perfect blank slate, silent protagonist that Chris never was. The player not seeing every moment of a character's existence doesn't make them any less of a player insert. And on the no player side, this is just the character we play as being in control without us seeing it. Next we get to the main events of the game, namely the conflict between Chris and the soul. Taking the player angle, this is exploring the dynamic between the player and the playable character. And here I have to address a point from Jaru's video. Basically, he argues that the game is not really exploring this dynamic because it's not bringing up this conflict enough compared to other themes in the game. And because we don't get to know Chris's thoughts and goals, we can't even be sure we are acting against them. I hope I got that right and I'm not completely misinterpreting this. Well, simply put, I don't agree with this. First of all, I don't think the player not seeing Chris's thoughts makes this dynamic any less real or interesting. Actually, I think it makes it more interesting and more tragic that neither the player nor Chris knows exactly what the other wants. This way they could both be working towards the same goal while sabotaging each other because of the lack of communication. And just because this theme isn't one of the game's main themes doesn't mean it isn't there. I think there are moments where the game could be exploring this idea and also enough game left to still make this a bigger point in the story later on. But I do agree with Jaru that in the no-player interpretation, this conflict could be about the game's broader themes of control and freedom. Again, go watch Jaru's video if you want to know more about his arguments. Now let's quickly take a bit of a weird route. This one is easy. All the strange meta stuff that happens here is either because of the player or because of the character controlling Chris. Though this might tell us something about how powerful this character is. I mean, they can clearly read people's minds. We will get to that later, but first let's go forward in the game to the chapters that haven't been released yet, because there is something to address there. Surely these two interpretations will become wildly different later in the story. I mean, making the player a part of the story and revealing a new character who's been there the whole time are completely different directions for the game to take, right? Well, they don't have to be. And this is where we get a bit more into speculation, because I don't actually know what will happen in the story. But there are ways of making both of these ideas work together. For example, if the soul at some point transforms into something else, that could still be a representation of us, or it could be its own character. Or if the soul gets some way to communicate directly with other characters, that could be the player, or some character communicating through the soul. Whatever actually happens, I think there will be some weird meta shenanigans that can be viewed from either of these perspectives. And I hope that all the points I brought up here create enough of a pattern to justify believing in this theory even when we can't know exactly how it will happen. But wait, there is one more counterpoint to the no player angle. What about Gaster talking to us on Twitter or through the survey program? That seems like a straightforward acknowledgement of the player. But in a franchise with diegetic game mechanics and lore shared through secret links in newsletters, can we really say that this isn't a representation of something in-game? Could this not just be Gaster reaching out to someone in the same universe, especially if that someone is a being outside his understanding? Which brings us to the biggest question of this theory. If someone is controlling Chris, and it's not the player, then who is it? Well, I don't think it really matters for this theory. Like I said, I think there's enough evidence for this theory that we don't really need to know where the story is going to believe it. So it doesn't really matter if you think this second entity is Des, or a piece of Gaster, or Chester Holiday. There is room to consider different options while believing in the general idea of the theory. However, I do think there is one option that is the most likely that I have alluded to in this video and in the thumbnail, and that is the angel. Most of the evidence for this is just the evidence for the player angel theory, But if the player can be the angel, I think the angel could also be the player character. The soul being the angel, or being in control of the angel, could be seen as the player being known as the angel in this universe, or as the angel being a character in this universe that we play as. This would explain why Gaster had to go to such lengths to contact this entity, and why he can read minds and control Chris and overwrite their save. My favorite part of this idea is that when you're asking for information about the shelter in church, Alvin tells Chris to seek the angel for guidance. According to this theory, the angel is literally guiding Chris at this moment, making them ask people about the shelter. So if this does end up being true, this line will be very funny. But this is just my favorite idea for who this character could be, and the theory does not rely on it being the angel. Finally, I have to bring up one more point from Jaru's video, which is that Toby Fox doesn't really do pure self-insert characters. And I do agree with that. Every character so far that has seemed like a self-insert has been revealed to be their own character. However, this doesn't make the player's actions any less meaningful. Let's use Frisk as an example. For most of Undertale, they seem like a representation of the player, and all their actions are interpreted as choices made by the player. Then, at the very end of the game, Frisk is revealed to be their own person, which opens completely new interpretations of their actions. They can even seemingly refuse our control in some instances. But these new interpretations don't invalidate the old ones. Sans judging you is still just as much about the morality of your actions as it is about Frisk's actions. And at the end of Deltarune, I believe the dynamic between Chris and the soul will be as much about the relationship between protagonist and player as it is about a character controlling Chris to reach their own goals. Well, that sure was a Deltarune second entity theory. I hope people won't get too mad at me for this, especially since my whole point was that these different theories aren't really that different. Like, I think for most theories where they call the soul the player, you can just switch player for soul and the theory works just fine without the player being there. And I don't think a third entity theory completely ruins the idea that the game does comment on the player's actions. Actually, I think I've also heard of third entity theories that say that Chris is controlled by the player and also possessed by someone else when they take the soul out. If you believe in something like that, I'm sorry, I don't think this theory works with that idea. But that, I believe, is everything I have to say here. Yeah, that's it. Bye.